some of the expenditure, a lot of it is actually backloaded beyond 2030, whereas the threat level is now
almost a year overdue. With 2 ministerial resignations later, Keir Starmer has finally released his government's defence investment plan. In one of his final acts as Prime Minister, Starmer set out a £15 billion increase in military spending, funded by current investment budgets or by cutting investment budgets in other areas. The £15 billion is more than the £13.5 billion reportedly secured by the previous Defence Secretary John Healey, who resigned in protest over that lower figure earlier this month. But it is still considerably less than the additional £28 billion sought by defence chiefs. There are also questions about whether the government can meet its commitment to spend 3% of GDP on defence by 2030. Updating the House earlier, Healey's successor Dan Jarvis insisted the target will be met.
Our commitment to NATO is absolute. I gave my word to the Secretary-General and to all our allies that promise will be met and a credible plan will be produced to ensure that it is. We will reach 3% in the next Parliament, with funding set out at the next spending review in which defence will be the number one priority.
Well, joining me now is host of the Times General and the Journalist podcast, Tom Newton-Dunn. Tom, good evening to you.
Good evening, Kate.
Let's start with the NATO commitment before we get into the detail. Is that being kicked into the long grass? Keir Starmer refusing to commit to get up to 3% by 2030.
Yeah, it is. That's precisely where it's being kicked into, or maybe the middle grass. So that he's booted it into the middle grass, which is the next spending review to be carried out next summer under, guess what, a different Prime Minister. So we won't see any new money until 2028. But, you know, it may be booted back again. And I learnt a new phrase today, Kate. Have you heard of the hockey stick? The hockey stick on a spending graph.
No.
Is that one new to you as well? So it was new to me. I was with the Journal today. Patrick Sanders, my co-host of the podcast, we were recording another one with an admiral, actually. And they talked about the hockey stick trajectory. So if you delay what you have to do, which is spending 3.5% of GDP on defence by 2035, which is the NATO target, you make it harder and harder and harder to get to that 3.5%. You'll have to do it in the last few years, which is, in other words, means increasing it in the shape of a hockey stick. So a bit of a flat bit and a very, very sharp uptick. And that means finding hundreds of billions potentially from, God knows where. And that's the problem I think the government has created with this. They have kicked the can down the road and they made the successor to Keir Starmer, Andy Burnham, or even his successor, their job far harder.
Yeah, because you're knocking it down the park. Currently, we're at 2.4%. That's up from 2.3% in 24-25. We know the Prime Minister committed to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2027. The current plan gets us there, but doesn't get us any further, getting to 3% 3 years later by the end of the decade. Unclear as to how we're going to do that. And we know that we're going to get to 3.5% by 2035 with an additional 1.5% on wider resilience and security. That's to meet that 5% set by Donald Trump and NATO. So that's just laying out where we're at the moment, and the task ahead for Andy Burnham, who's going to have to find well over £4 billion worth from current government departments, really, unless his growth strategy really does get off and running incredibly quickly. Let's get into the detail, Tom, if that's okay. What else strikes you about this? There are various commitments within it. What do you like? What do you not like?
There's some good bits in there. Let me just quickly go back to those numbers again, and let's not try to bore everyone so rotten by talking about billions and percentage figures all the time. But just to give you a scale of the task here, there's 15 billion extra for defence today, as you've been reporting. The chiefs asked for 28 billion just to simply meet the commitments over the next 4 years. And this is money over 4 years, not every year. But actually, if you look at what we need to spend to deliver the Strategic Defence Review from last summer, which is a really good transformative document, completely modernising and updating the UK's armed forces for any potential threat that could be coming our way, it's more like 100 billion. By my calculations, over that 4 year period, and maybe even more. So, add 15 billion from 100 billion, you can see it's not even a fifth of where we need to be. So that is the massive scale of the task here, which as you point out, the governor's ducked. So no more percentages, no more billion figures, I promise you. That's it for that from me anyway. In terms of what it does do, actually, this move on to autonomous vehicles, so, drones in the air, as we see fighting in Ukraine, it dominates the war in Ukraine now. We're buying more of those. Drones underwater, unmanned ships, unmanned submarines to patrol the Atlantic and the English Channel. Good stuff, good things. Drones on wheels, tracked vehicles, as you see in Ukraine as well. It's all really useful stuff, this. And fighter plane drones flying alongside manned fighter planes. So it's really good. The problem is the scale. So the scale of what we're able to buy with this pittance of money we've just been talking about, which I promise I won't go into ever again. But what we're doing, you can only buy a certain amount if you only spend a certain amount. And that's what we're doing. So it is a mere token of what we're going towards. And some other things I think, worth pointing out. I'm quite pleased they kept something called FCAP, which is a future 6th generation fighter jet called Tempest. That's really impressive. More money for special forces. Their budget's going up by 12%. They're the tip of the spear, and they do some pretty useful things strategically all over the world. So, it is all decent. It's all the right sort of thing. It's just woefully short on where we need to be. So it's not transformational. What it is basically a sticking plaster to get us through and to say we're doing the right thing when everyone, NATO included especially, aren't going to be fooled by this, sadly.
The reinforcements for housing for military personnel, that's been knocked down the chain a little bit. Dan Jarf has admitted that today. There's due to be quite a lot of money spent on housing for the armed forces, and that's had to be delayed. I mean, the argument will be that the government was blindsided by the request for an extra £28 billion because of a black hole in the finances. That was discovered after the Treasury thought that they'd found the money. And many say that is because of a lack of good record keeping, a lack of accountability in the Ministry of Defence, and that whichever year this is, whatever commitment this is, Tom, the MOD will always ask for more money. That is just inevitable. You never get a story about defence spending without someone somewhere very connected with defence saying it's not enough.
And you never hear the MOD saying, we haven't spent our full budget this year. We can give some back to the Treasury. That never happens either. So, look, I think you're right. And Al Khan's the Armed Forces Minister who resigned a couple of weeks ago when you and I last spoke after that great day when John Healey resigned as well. He was making this point, the MOD can do their business better. And, I, having, watched this sadly for years now, I think it's all about, good, well-meaning military officers coming in, doing a job in procurement for a couple of years. They're negotiating big contracts, multi-billion contracts with, the sharks who work for BAE Systems or Lockheed Martin or these sort of massive companies who can eat these guys for breakfast, quite frankly, simply because they've got the experience and they know the tricks. And that's where I think things go wrong. But yeah, the MOD can spend their money a bit better, but that isn't the problem here. You're right. There was a big row about where did that extra 28 billion come from. I thought we had enough money. That basically came from the Prime Minister sitting down with the Defence Secretary and the Chancellor last summer to say, right, we're going to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. That's great, isn't it? And you can pay for this SDR, this incredibly transformational SPR, with that new money, with that 2.5% rise. And the Defence Secretary said, yep, absolutely, I certainly can, Prime Minister, without even beginning to do the budgeting. And that was the political failure. It's a failure of John Healey's. It's a failure of the defence chief, Tony Radakin, who was the chief defence staff at the time. You slightly wonder what he was selling. I mean, it was a great bit of salesmanship. Say, well, yeah, don't worry, put all this through and we'll work out how to pay for it later. It's someone else's job now. Rich Knighton's the new CDS. So you could say that was a bit of foolery or clever Whitehall gaming. But together, government itself, the system of government, have really failed. They failed everybody here. But what they've been unable to do is sort out that failure with that extra spending. It means tough decisions. It means finding money from the welfare budget, from the pensions budget, from the health budget, from budget somewhere, because you can't tax more and you can't borrow more, really. So it is tough decisions, but by not taking them, you just make problems worse. And, this is Andy Burnham's great inheritance. And one thing I've been wondering all day long is, where is Andy Burnham? Because he's going to own this mess in a few weeks' time. going to be on his watch. And let's remember all the other countries in Europe, they're speeding ahead.
Yes. Well, he probably doesn't want a lot to do with it at the moment. It is Keir Starmer's day, I'm sure he'd argue. But he is going to have to deal with some of the mess afterwards. And as Stephen Swinford, the political editor of The Times, points out, he's going to have to find that £4.7 billion in his next budget, which means, public finances, tax rises or cuts that he's got to make. As ever, it's a huge pleasure. Tom Newton-Dunn, co-host of The Times General and the Journalist podcast. And I presume you've got a new episode coming out later, have you, Tom, on this?
Okay, yeah, it's coming out Thursday morning, actually. The former Deputy SACA, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, a Brit, an admiral, just resigned. He's giving us his take on what the NATO summit is going to make of all this next week, where Keir Starmer has to go. And can you imagine turning up at the NATO summit with this sort of rubbish bit of homework, with this sort of dogged essay that is not even half as long as it should be? That's the fun that he's going to have next week. All
right, Tom, great to speak to you. Thank you. So the next episode of The Times, the General and the Journalist podcast with Tom Newton-Dunn and a whole host of other important personnel with you on Thursday morning. Tom, thank you. Let's get some reaction now to the Defence Investment Plan with Tan Dhesi. He's a Labour MP and chair of the Defence Select Committee. Tan, good evening to you.
Good evening, Kate.
There is a funding shortfall created by the Defence Investment Plan today. As we've mentioned, Andy Burnham will need to find around £4.7 billion in what is going to presumably be his first budget. And you're concerned because there was no commitment to get to 3% of GDP on defence spending by 2030. That is something that Keir Starmer had committed to before.
Well, the first thing is that I welcomed that finally we have a defence investment plan which is funded, backed by the Treasury, and also it's scalable. So if more money is made available, then certain key facets within the defence investment plan can actually be scaled up. So whether it's with regards to drones...
It isn't funded, though, is it, Tan, is my point. If Andy Burnham's got to find an extra £4.7 billion because that's been knocked down the chain a little bit, this isn't fully funded necessarily, is it?
Yeah, so funded apart from that line item, which over the next 4 years, starting off from the budget, the new Chancellor would then have to advise where that is coming. But obviously, in an overall sense, there is a lot of money that's going in, and it will lead us to reach 2.7% of GDP spend by 2030. But I don't think that meets the moment, because we need to reach 3% of GDP spend by 2030, something that our Defence Committee has been calling for, given the increased threat level. What was good is that in terms of scalable facets, whether it's with regards to housing, whether it's with regards to drones, whether it's the integrated air and missile defence, and the artificial intelligence usage within defence as well. So all of that is possible. However, where there is concern amongst many of us Defence Committee members is that there is a lack of detail. We were promised that this Defence Investment Plan would actually go further than previous defence equipment plans, which set out over 10 years a fully funded expenditure envelope. They also had, unlike this one, we could see differences between, there was clarity between procurement and recovery expenditure as well. So there are certain things that we're concerned about. Also, some of the expenditure, a lot of it is actually backloaded beyond 2030, whereas the threat level is now. So the positive things for your listeners to take on board is the fact that there is £8.6 billion for the Global Combat Air Programme. That is for the next generation fighter jets. So I know our Italian and Japanese friends will be happy with that.
Tempest aircraft.
That precisely. And the government has also set out its priorities, so whether that's homeland security, whether it's nuclear, which has seen a £64 billion allocation, whether it's in terms of helping our Ukrainian friends, the £5 billion plus that is going in for drones, and the investments within autonomous, because I think we do need to learn the lessons from Ukraine. However, the devil ultimately will be in the detail, because a lot has been offered by previous governments when we've had these strategic defense reviews and then the defense equipment plans. Unfortunately, some of the savings that successive governments have proposed, some of those don't quite materialize. So here, there is a line item that more than £10 billion worth of efficiency savings are included within this. So we would want to delve into the detail of that to see that the government can actually make that materialise.
Yeah, so it's £10.7 billion worth of efficiency savings. Again, that is going to have to be magicked up by Andy Burnham if, as we all expect, he's to become Prime Minister. That is going to be an issue for him. And, Keir Starmer already upsetting some MPs today by cutting into energy projects and road projects as well. I've seen more than a couple of MPs talk about planned work to roads, really important work that is very far down the line, which has been cancelled incredibly late in the day, just as Keir Starmer was giving his speech. I mean, the cynics among us might wonder whether Keir Starmer here is setting Andy Burnham up. He was able to announce this because, as you've said, some of these key commitments he won't have to deal, well, all of them he won't have to deal with, but some of these key commitments he can promise without needing to have an answer about them materialising. That is no longer his problem. Do you think Starmer's stitching Burnham up a little bit here?
Well, the Prime Minister wanted to get that defence investment plan out. I know that was promised back in autumn of last year. I have been raising that again and again for several months. In fact, I questioned the Prime Minister last December within the liaison committee, that's the committee of chairs, wherein I delved into different facets of defence, but in particular that we needed to get that certainty, that 10-year plan out there, because it's important that we give that clear demand signal to our allies and adversaries that we're serious about defence, and it's also about mobilising our British defence industrial base.
Yeah.
So the defence investment plan, it was important that it came out. My understanding was that the Prime Minister had actually made Andy Burnham and his team aware of
parts of it, I think, beyond what he could be.
Because I wasn't privy to those discussions.
Can I ask you a final one, Tan? You and others have talked about the UK needing to be ready for an attack by Russia by 2030. Keir Starmer boldly announced today we will be able to withstand an attack by Russia by 2030, which was sort of almost laying out a timeline in exactly the wrong way. But it sounds like you're certain Russia is a threat and that threat could come to pass by 2030. Do you think the UK will be attacked by Russia?
Okay, I raised this issue on the floor of the House during Prime Minister's questions just over 2 weeks ago, where I reiterated the remarks that the Prime Minister himself had made, where he had warned us that we, as NATO, needed to be ready by 2030 from an attack by Russia. That's the intel based on other NATO nations as well. I know that many other nations, especially those in the eastern flank, have significantly increased their defence spending. Many of them have actually got targets not just of reaching 3.5%, but in excess of 5%. So geography matters. But as far as we're concerned, we are bound by Article 5. So if there is an attack on another NATO ally, we then need to come to their collective aid. So it's important that we invest in our capabilities. And also let us not forget that the UK at present, Kate, is the third most targeted nation on the planet in terms of cyber attacks. It has cost British businesses in excess of £15 billion in the last year alone. We all are aware of the very famous JLR case where people couldn't get to work for
Jaguar
several
Land
weeks.
Rover. Yeah, agreed.
Precisely. So that's why we need to be fully prepared, because otherwise we'll be sorry in the long run.
Tan Desi, thank you for speaking to us. Really appreciate it. Tan Desi is a Labour MP and chair of the Defence Committee. Good to have you with us.